So a very good afternoon to all of you, and, particularly to my colleague Pradeep Yadav, whose organization I used to work in some years ago, and to Ms. Helen Brand, who has been CEO of an institution that I belong to and have belonged to for about 35 years now, which is the ACCA. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the government in India is managing its finances and how we see our finances evolve in the Covid-19 aftermath. And maybe I can say a little bit, very little, what other parts of the economy are facing in the finance field. So I'll start by saying that we entered the Covid-19 era with an economy that was not really firing on all cylinders. It was growing slower than many people think India can grow. But the first 2 months of this calendar year were actually good months in terms of showing an uptick in the rate of growth. And we actually thought we were at the beginning of an improved rate of economic growth. And then we were presented with this irritating virus that arrived in March, after which everything changed. And we are no longer even looking at what the world was like in January and February. So when the virus arrived in India, which late February, early March, when we had the first case, the first few weeks we expected some kind of slowdown, but to be very frank, we hadn't anticipated the magnitude of the impact that we have seen in the last few months. But by the third week of March, we knew that we were entering uncharted territory. And then on March the 22nd, India to one of the world's lockdowns, and one of the earliest lockdowns in terms of the sequence of the virus. We went into lockdown when we had approximately 100 cases in the country. So it was at that time, many people were posing the lives versus livelihoods trade-off. I think government in India took a clear choice in March to prioritize lives over livelihoods. And in fact, in the phrase that the Prime Minister used, "Jaan hai to jahan hai," that is, you only have, the world exists if life exists. And if there's no life, there is no world. So prioritized lives in the first few weeks. There was a nationwide complete lockdown. Epidemiological models tell us that we may have saved maybe 70,000 lives and about 1 to 2 million cases of COVID-19 through the lockdown. The first phase of the lockdown, the financial impacts on the government were that the government had to, since we knew it was a complete lockdown, shutting down a country of 1.3 billion for 3 weeks is not a trivial enterprise. So the government stepped in with a package of relief. This package was focused almost entirely on the poor and the vulnerable. So we came up with a package of providing free food to 800 million people in the public distribution system, free cooking gas to 80 million households, cash in their bank accounts to 200 million women in rural and urban areas. The government took on partial wage payments for people whose salaries were less than 50,000 rupees a month, and also arranged for releases from provident funds, welfare funds to be liberalized so that people could take back money that they saved without necessarily adhering to the usual all of those amounts. That was announced in the very first week of the lockdown, and the lockdown eventually got extended. It went on till in slightly relaxed form until the end of May, after which more relaxed lockdown, which we call the unlockdown. We then had the second government financial response, which came in the month of May. This was called the Self-Reliant India Package, or the Atmanirbhar Bharat Package. This financial package consisted of a collection of guarantees, deferments of tax and credit payments, and fiscal interventions. And the total size of the three of them together was 10% of India's GDP, with credit guarantees accounting for the lion's share of that. So the flagship element in that package was an unconditional extension of 20% extra credit to any business which was standard as of 29th February 2019. So that we chose that subset because if the business was creditworthy on the 29th of February, then we assumed that without any further assessment, they deserve to be supported with extra credit. So that was for approximately 1.5% of GDP, and about 1/3 of what was announced then has now been sanctioned by the banks. There were other guarantee and credit measures. There were some economic reforms because the government also saw this crisis as an opportunity to do things that in good times we may not have perhaps taken up the courage to do. So there have been a lot of restrictions on agricultural marketing in India, which have effectively prevented farmers from selling their produce where they wanted to sell it because there were regulated markets that had local monopolies over the marketing of agricultural produce. Obviously, there are groups that are in the present system, and it had not been reformed, though lots of committees had advocated. So in this COVID-19 package, the government announced a decision to actually change that system so that farmers can now market anywhere in India, regulated, unregulated. They have the freedom to sell produce to the highest bidder anywhere in the country without having to go through local regulated markets. There was a new policy on the Indian public sector, which divides the public sector into two parts: strategic areas. In the strategic areas, the government announced that it would retain a maximum of 4 enterprises in each strategic sector, 1 to 4. And if there were more public sector enterprises in that area beyond 4, the rest would be either privatized or consolidated. And in the non-strategic sectors, the government has taken a decision that all the enterprises in the non-strategic sectors will be privatized. And it's the first time that the government of India has used the word privatization in an official policy, because we used to refer to it as disinvestment in the past. So it signals again a change in policy. There's a new sector which has been opened up to private enterprise, which is coal mining and mining in general. So these were some of the things that were done in the second part of the government's financial response. And then the third part of the financial response came last week, or rather a couple of days ago, when we announced an extension of the free food for 800 million people for a further 5 months, which again costs approximately 0% of our GDP. Having done all this, I'm often asked whether the government package is big enough or is sufficient to put the economy back on the rails. And the honest answer is it is not, because I don't think any government package is sufficient to put the economy back on the rails. The view that we have sitting here is that the key to the recovery of economic activity is not further government intervention. It is basically the abatement of the virus. It is basically when the consumer feels that they can actually go out, buy things, goods, services, go to shops, go to malls, travel, fly, etc. Because we have one piece of empirical evidence of the money that we transferred to the 200 million poor women in India. It's spent in those bank accounts where the money was transferred is approximately 50% of what was transferred. And these are poor people, and the amounts that we transferred are not munificent. And in spite of that, only 50% has been spent. So basically what this indicates is that consumers are saving up because they see us as living through bad times. And there's only so much that can be done in terms of injecting liquidity into the economy and expecting it to revive. So we basically think that the turnaround will come maybe a couple of months from now, when we have seen the worst of the epidemic and the numbers are starting to fall and people have the confidence that they can resume normal lives and normal business. So I must confess that our packages and financial measures that we have taken are basically painkillers and palliatives. The cure is really on the health side. So what we've done on the health side is we have spent a lot of money on the health sector. We've spent we've given the states a lot of money with which to do tests and create new ICU beds, buy ventilators. We've reconfigured 5,000 railway coaches into hospital beds. So a lot of money has gone into the health sector. And when the epidemic starts abating, I think that's when we will see the economy pick up. Coming more specifically to the issue of the government's own finances, we face probably one of the most difficult financial situations, not just in living memory, but probably in the memory of several generations, because we've had wars before. But in a war, there's some supply disruption, but there's a lot of additional. We face a situation now where we have a suppression of both supply and demand, and a precipitous fall in the government's tax revenue, because we have extended dates for payments of taxes, activity has gone down, imports are down, sales are down, so GST, customs is down, income tax is down, corporation tax is down, almost everything is down. Meanwhile, everyone wants a good package, and we've got 3 good packages, which are never good enough for people who want packages, but 3 sets of nicely wrapped packages have come at a time of sharply diminishing revenue. This means that the challenge that we have in the Ministry of Finance is extremely acute. We, at the same time, have to protect our long-term macroeconomic stability. So we are following a couple of strategies. One, we are looking very closely at our expenditure budget. We are enhancing budgets in areas like health, food supply, protection of the poor. We are reprioritizing in many other areas by switching budgets from ministries and activities that don't need them as much this year, because it is a special year and a special circumstance. So to give you a simple but perhaps not very material example, I don't think the Ministry of Culture or the Ministry of Tourism is going to spend very much this year. If we let them, they would probably spend it, but we're not going to let them. So we have imposed a lot of cash controls. We have guidelines where we've classified activities into A, B, and C categories. So A category is primarily health and relief, where we have no restrictions on the spending of the budget. The B category is the middle category, where we have some restrictions. In the C category, we've imposed tight restrictions on paying anything other than salaries and interest payments. So with that, we have been able to manage our cash a little better. We're also increasing government borrowing. Obviously, there's going to be a substantial increase in government borrowing this year, which means a very high level of fiscal deficit. But I must tell you that we are somewhat optimistic that among the various shapes of recovery that we are talking about, the U, the V, the W, and the Z, and so on, we are expecting something like a V-shaped recovery. This year being at the bottom of the V, and the next year being closer to the top of the V. So in that sense, we are not despondent. It's facing a very difficult year, but I think we will pull through. And I always think India is better at, managing the downside than in achieving the upside. I think we will probably do this job better than we will reaching 9% growth. I think we'll end this year reasonably well. We will probably not do as badly as the worst expectations expect from us. And in terms of the future, frankly, I'm not so sure that this marks a huge long-term discontinuity in the trends in the way finance is managed. It's too hard to say. I think many habits that have changed in the lockdown may actually disappear when we completely normalize, if we completely normalize. And if the epidemic is forgotten a year from now, a lot of old practices are likely to resume. Working from home has picked up a lot in government. But one of the things that we are finding is working from home works very well for existing teams of cohesive people who are used to working with each other. But it's a difficult way in which to build new teams. So if you have people who've never worked with each other, starting to work with each other on WebEx, it just doesn't work very well. So it's okay for the short run, but I think in the long run, whether it's teaching or offices or managing, I think we will have to return to a normal where there's a lot of interpersonal interaction directly, and perhaps the trend in terms of electronic communications, etc. It will hasten the trend, but I'm not sure that it's going to be a big discontinuity. So those few words, let me thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, sir, for your analysis and also citing the trends which you see. And as I said, that probably this is going to be a little short-lived, which is and not actually becoming the next normal or the new normal. Also sharing with us the various initiatives and the policy decisions which the government has been taking time and again. But as you also mentioned that coming back to normal is also going to be more depending upon the consumer sentiments and how quickly or how quickly we can actually build on the customer confidence of getting back, and that is when we are going to be seeing the economy being. But as far as the government is concerned, it has been taking these steps. It has been coming up with these packages, and it is, as we said, it's a V-shaped recovery which we are right now seeing. So thank you, sir, for your views. And if we have your permission, certain questions, if we can take.
Yes, certainly. I have to leave at 5 minutes past 5, so that's another 15 minutes.
Okay, so with that, I will quickly hand over to Mr. Shailesh V. Haribhakti. He's an eminent chartered accountant, and as I mentioned, he's the chairman of Mumbai and the Western region for IoT India. He's currently is also the board chairman, the audit committee chair, the independent director of multiple boards in India, and also the chairman of Shailesh Haribhakti and Associates India. So I would like to request him to kindly chair the Q&A, and we'll take questions from Ms. Helen and from the secretary. So over to Mr. Haribhakti.
Thank you very much, Vimi, and very warm welcome to you, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Somanathan, and Helen. Both of you have given us extraordinary food for thought. And my first question is a stringing of both the global and the domestic perspectives. And the question is that where we are looking at confident consumption being brought back, is there a correlation both abroad and in India to reducing the apparent burden of compliance? In India particularly, sir, we have 58,000 plus compliances. I just did a number count of it and updated it very recently. And 8,000 of them have potentially a criminal situation. So can that reversal or taking a saw to that kind of compliance burden, can that transform the confidence quotient that both of you spoke about? And therefore, a related question, can we think in terms of positively disrupting by shortening the legal redress cycle, by reducing the compliance burden dramatically, and by making sure that resources, both of equity and debt, are available to the absolutely starved sectors of our economy?
Should I go first?
Yes, please, sir.
Please do, please. I feel like I might be treading on your territory here.
I see a lot of domestic content in the questions. So I should help Helen by going first. I think you're absolutely right on trying to minimize compliances. I think that is something that the government is conscious of. Perhaps we have more to do. We have already, and I think the finance said that more than once, that we are actively looking to decriminalize as many sections of corporate law and other economic laws as we can, so that fines replace potential jail. Not many people are actually taken to jail, but the threat of it and the slow progress of prosecution in India are punishments in themselves, and we recognize that. So we are certainly moving towards more and more offenses becoming compoundable in terms of fines, and perhaps eliminating some kinds of offenses completely. That also needs to be done. But right now is to decriminalize. That is a priority for the government, and the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is working actively on that. You mentioned the point about the number of compliances. I have no doubt you must have done your inventory correctly. But I would say that I've lived abroad for quite some time, and I don't know whether I can compare an exact number, but it depends on how you count. And if you count, I think many countries have lots of compliances. In fact, more sophisticated a country becomes, the more kinds of tends to have in terms of environment and social protection and employment protection. And it's not something to get rid of. India perhaps has got this peculiar thing where we have elite activism in many sectors that are much ahead of our economic levels of growth. So we have laws and things that are based on Western practice and an economy that is somewhere near, sub-Saharan Africa, and that kind of, that combination can be pretty difficult for industry. I understand that, but I think we shouldn't lose the protection of these progressive laws, because we do want workers to be protected, the environment to be protected. We don't want climate change to happen. So all of these things need to happen. But I agree with you that we need a better balance between number of compliances, the severity of the compliances, and of course the manner of enforcement of the compliances. You mentioned the legal process. I must say, with all due respect, that I have absolutely no control over the way courts in India behave. So the only thing that we can do from the executive side is to increase the number of opportunities to solve these problems without going to court. Once it gets into court, Indian courts are extremely independent, and they're very independent of the executive, certainly. And so there's very little that we can do in terms of speeding up things. And even if a law is passed which fixes a time limit, and about the bankruptcy code, the courts always say, well, that's the law, but that's only advice, and we're not bound. There's not much we can do on this.
Yeah, if I can just say from a global perspective, in the short term, certainly what we've been seeing is regulators can very much intervene to create conditions for survival. So holidays on certain regulations, tax compliance, or even as much as your motor vehicle taxation or whatever it might be, putting those holidays in place and being very clear that there isn't that pressure on people. But I have heard conversations about regulators as drivers of growth, or drivers of prosperity post crisis, and that's very much the thinking that you were talking about, where we can create the conditions for success and innovation, and releasing the regulatory burden where it's possible to do so, or maybe focusing on different, we all know, and I think we've seen again the emphasis on environment and health, and it might be that the burdens go in a different direction to the ones that are in currently, to drive a different kind of economic growth out of the crisis, and helping that build back better concept that people are talking about. So regulators should put their super person capes on and see the opportunity to come to the aid of the business world, and I think therefore to the societies where those businesses operate.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Mr. Somanathan. Very forthright answer. My second question is about the brilliant innovation that the government of India has done. What it has done is it has given relief, which is so required, in kind, by making food available from our towering stocks, which we had built up over all these years. And even this year, a bountiful harvest has been properly put away so that we can actually release this food. My question is, are there other such huge opportunities sitting somewhere? For example, converting railway unoccupied compartments to hospital beds was brilliant. How about converting the vehicles which are today not plying on our roads or sitting idle into ambulances? One of the critical things that we are seeing is that people need that to actually get to where they need to get when they need treatment. That's just one example. The other economic example could be, is there a potential for us to do a massive peopleization of the equity markets by making equity available to people who, just as Jan Dhan accounts have had an electrifying effect in India, is there a way to make a similar effect happen on the equity count? So these are the two questions that both of you can answer. Again, there's a global and a domestic perspective.
Well, I certainly, if I just start on the repurposing or reimagining question, which I think we've seen, whether it's airline companies producing ventilators, or completely rethinking what they're using their case capacity to do within the current circumstances, that's been hugely impressive. Going forward, I think there's a pressure both from the public expectation will be very much that all parts, whether it's government or private business, will be looking more closely at that public good outcome. I think there'll be a clear expectation of that. And I think the business world probably should see this as an opportunity, but it does mean doing different things and using resources. It is all about resource, whether it's natural capital or people capital or the cars, etc. you talk about. It's about how do we use those resources to the greatest effect. And I think that there might be some challenges to the old capitalist view of what it is that businesses are there to produce, but that was coming anyway. I just think we've seen that accelerated by the current COVID crisis. So let's see this as an opportunity, but it does require imagination and it does require new skills.
Would you label it conscientious capitalism?
That's a good one. Yeah, yes, and because the old system has not been shown to be totally broken. It certainly needs to evolve. Yeah.
Sir, can we get your response to yourself?
Changing the uses of existing assets and existing advantages is a good idea. We've tried to do that, as you said, both with food and with railway coaches, but it is not always possible for the government to take the lead on highly decentralized private resources. So I think we should leave it to the Indian Jugaad to do all. They're pretty good at local innovation. Right. And I think the government would be a very clumsy instrument with which to do some of these things, especially the central government is so far removed from local communities. But I think the idea is good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. A third question that comes up is, are these reliefs that the world is awash in sustainable? We have an unbelievable situation where $5 trillion of actual fresh resources have been made available, either through printing or through making more credit available. And we have a stock today of $55 trillion of sovereign paper. Is there a market for it? Has the risk moved to the sovereign, from equity markets to debt to sovereigns? And is this all sustainable? And if it is, what is the way that we will, when we see the V shape, how will we pull back and how will it actually affect economies around the world?
Since I have a time constraint, let me give you my answer, and then I'll take leave of you if you don't mind. Yes, obviously we cannot sustain packages of this kind every year, but I think I know that a lot of people wanted bigger packages from the government. We have always had to balance the long term and the short term, and what you're bringing up is the long term sustainability of our macro economies. So we have not taken our eyes off that set of instruments while we're doing the short term. And I think that is precisely why we're calibrating them carefully in terms of fiscal versus credit guarantees versus deferrals. It is not prudent to assume that you can simply pump prime your way through this crisis. In fact, it's our view that you can't do it, because even if you add more into this, until the pandemic is behind us, we're not going to see proportionate results. So every additional installment of pump priming is going to give you lower returns than the previous one. But in terms of what's happening up to now, I think what the government of India has spent on the 3 packages, and we are quite conscious of the fact that they may not be the last. I think if we end this pandemic in, say, 3 to 6 months from now, we would not be on an unsustainable path. I mean, we are quite confident that we can see ourselves through this. Yes, we may have a debt to GDP ratio of the state plus center that exceeds 80%, but let us remember that, you know, there is a kind of double standard on credit ratings. India is at 80 plus. Oh, that's very high. But Japan's only at 250%.
Yeah.
And the US is only at 30. And, you know, so many EU countries, in spite of the fact that they have much lower growth rates than we do. And our long-term growth rates are likely to be, even if you have a pessimistic assumption, 5.5 to 6%. So with GDP growing at 5.5 to 6%, interest rates at 4%, and with our debt to GDP at 80%, sustainability is really not a problem so long as we don't go mad and splurge.
Absolutely.
And I can tell you, no intention of doing that. So I think we're on safe ground.
That is
Thank you very much.
So reassuring. Thank you very much, sir. This was fantastic. We
Thank
all
you.
would like to wish you all success in every strategy that you pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.